welcome everyone. Good morning. Thank you for coming here today on this dreary Thursday morning. I hear the sun is meant to come out later today, which is promising. But welcome to the session on building electrification. This is a topic that is at the forefront of everyone's minds at the moment with the recent passing of the Seattle Energy Code update, which will require using electricity for heating and hot water in new construction buildings. Just to start, I'll give a quick introduction on the format for today. We have 4 great panelists here to talk about the strategies that they have used to get to mostly electric buildings. We have Anita from Unico Properties, Brandon from Vulcan, Alex from the Port of Seattle, and Dan from Säzän Environmental Services. And I will let them introduce themselves in a little bit more detail later on. So we're going to have them answer a few questions for me for the first kind of 30 to 40 minutes. And then that should leave about 10 to 15 minutes from everyone else on the call. And if you have questions that come up as we go, just use the chat function and we'll be monitoring that throughout. So I'd like to just start by giving a brief introduction to the Seattle 2030 district and what we do. So the district is committed to transforming our city by significantly reducing the environmental impacts of buildings by the year 2030. And we're doing this because without transformative change in the buildings where we live and work, we will lose the climate battle in the Pacific Northwest. We feel that the district has a unique ability to connect and convene decision makers who can influence corporate culture and help create policies that will help solve the climate crisis here in the Pacific Northwest. We are a public-private partnership, and the main reason I say that we're private sector led is because we see public sector programs lag or even fail sometimes when there's a change in administration. So we're working to create market-based solutions with our members to achieve our goals. And the goals of the district is to achieve a 50% reduction in energy, water, and transportation emissions by the year 2030, with interim goals leading up to that. And then for new construction and major renovations, the goal is to get to carbon neutral buildings by the year 2030. And the current goal is about an 80% reduction in energy from the baseline. And just as a comparison to what today's code that just passed, that's probably about 20-ish% better than the new energy code that passed. I mentioned the shared mission of the district. And this is the reason why so many building owners like the district model. The goal is a district goal and it's not an individual building goal. So you commit to achieving the goal and you may be able to achieve that 50% goal if you're a newer building, but if you're a newer or older building, you might only be able to achieve kind of a 30% reduction, but on average, we'll achieve that 50% goal for the whole district, which will put us on a path to climate stabilization. So you can see here, this is the district area. We pretty much cover most of downtown and the surrounding neighborhoods. We currently have 260 buildings committed to the district, which is roughly 60 million square feet. And just kind of as a point of reference, just to kind of use some landmarks, we go from SoDo, it's around about the Starbucks Center down in SoDo, all the way up to Lake Union. I think most people know Lake Union. And then we go from the waterfront. So we have one of Alex's buildings here on the port, on the waterfront, and we go all the way up to Capitol Hill and First Hill. And that little tail at the bottom there is where the Bullitt Center is. So just a little bit on how we work and what we actually do for our members. So we convene hit the slide. We convene business leaders and government officials to create policies and incentives that work for both parties to achieve the district goals. We provide education sessions to our property owners and managers on new strategies, kind of like we're going to be doing today. We provide demonstration projects on how to achieve the goals of the district. Also, like we're going to be doing today, kind of showcasing some of the buildings that have done this and how they've implemented them. We do a lot of advocacy for our members as well, to just try and work on what kind of policies, incentives, programs will work for them to help achieve the ambitious goals that we've set, and also work with the city as well to make sure that, again, like I said earlier, they work for both parties. We facilitate a lot of conversation amongst building owners to share information. One thing that building owners agreed on when the district was first founded was that building owners tend to compete on everything to do with their buildings. So whether it's kind of price per square foot, amenities, whatever it takes to get tenants into their buildings, but they don't need to compete on the environment. And that's something that they can share that knowledge of. And we provide a space for them to share that knowledge in a safe way. And lastly, we celebrate our members. We have our annual Vision Awards every year. I'm hoping this year it gets to be in person. It's in October, so I'm hoping by then we're able to gather in large groups, potentially even shake each other's hands and maybe even hug each other, who knows. But during that, we give out 4 awards to our members who have showcased exemplary buildings in energy, water, and transportation, and overall leadership. And I believe a few of our panelists have won those awards over the last few years. Lastly, I just want to kind of end with where we are at the moment. So we have 8 years and 9 months to achieve the 2030 district goals. And the IPCC report here shows that we need to get to those net zero emissions by the year 2050. So it's essential that we reduce by 50% by the year 2030 in order to achieve that goal. As you can see by this graph, the longer we take to get to that 50% reduction, the more extreme our reductions become to get to net zero. So if we don't hit it, then it kind of moves down to 2045 or 2040. And then lastly, as always, I'd love to thank our sponsors. Oh, this is actually an older slide because Unico is actually a carbon neutral sponsor now. So extra special thanks to Unico. But thank you to everyone here on the slide. We would not be able to do our work without the support of these sponsors. And it really helps us do a lot of our advocacy work, and particularly these education sessions as well. And then also like to extend thanks to our funders, Boeing, King County, and the Bullitt Foundation. They definitely have been huge supporters of the district over the years, and have helped us with a lot of our programs, particularly around our stormwater management. So with that, I will start with introductions. So I'm gonna highlight everyone here, but Anita, if you would like to start.
Sure. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this panel. My name is Anita Jirgay. I'm the Director of Sustainable Real Estate for Unico Properties. Unico is a private equity real estate investor, developer, and operator. We have assets in growth markets across the country. So Seattle, Portland, Denver, Boulder, and then a few buildings in Austin, Nashville, and Salt Lake City. And overall, our owned and managed portfolio is a little over 17 million square feet. So I stepped in as director at the beginning of the year for our real estate or sustainable real estate group. And I lead a group of 6 passionate folks dedicated to driving efficiency and green building practices in our development and operations.
Thanks, Anita. Alex,
Thanks.
you go next.
Sure, thanks. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here, and thank you, Matthew, for the invitation to participate in this panel. My name is Alex Adams. I manage Port of Seattle's Maritime Sustainability Program, and that includes all of our climate change, air quality, and energy work. Excuse me, I have a frog in my throat. So for those of you who live in Seattle, you're probably very well aware of Port of Seattle. For those of you who are not from Seattle, Port of Seattle exists all along Elliott Bay, the main sort of body of water in Seattle. We are what we call a landlord port, meaning that we both own and operate some of our buildings, but we also lease a lot of our commercial and industrial real estate. So some of the lines of business that Port of Seattle manages includes 2 cruise terminals, a grain terminal, waterfront properties such as Pier 69, the World Trade Center, a conference center down on the waterfront, and a number of other recreational and commercial fishing locations like Fisherman's Terminal, Shilshole Bay Marina. We have, in 2009, we used about 300,000 therms of natural gas, and that emitted about 1,200 metric tons of CO2. And we are making a commitment to eliminate natural gas by 2030 for used in all of our buildings. So as Matthew said, we have a lot of work to do in 8 years, 9 months. Is that right? So the clock is ticking. So I'm interested in hearing what my fellow panelists are thinking about this, and I'm happy to share what Port of Seattle is thinking. Thank you.
Yeah, Alex, that time is right. I'd like to put that at the beginning of every session now. I'm kind of on the countdown to just emphasize that 2030 is not 10 years away, as a lot of people keep thinking it is. Time is ticking. Brandon, why don't you go next?
I'm Brandon Morgan, Director of Residential Development at Vulcan Real Estate. I've worn a few hats since I've been there for, I guess, last 17 years. One of those has been the sustainability hat, leading our team, although several of us are involved in various sustainability efforts, but I was on the original 2030 board, the founding board, and then my colleague Kiki Graham is on the board today representing Vulcan, but still like to check in now and then, and thank you, Matthew, for inviting me on this panel. Historically, Vulcan has since we started developing in South Lake Union, has had sustainability as a major priority and guiding principle. We're usually challenging ourselves every year to push the envelope on development of new construction buildings, both office and residential, and some life sciences as well. Been an early advocate of the LEAD program, to actually helped design some of the first pilot programs in the LEAD program. Still passionate supporters today of that program. We've also partnered with Salmon Safe, and I see Ellen's on the call, and been proud supporters of that program in bringing it to an urban context. And I'd say that we've expanded our geography more recently out of South Lake Union, where our legacy land holdings have been, into other jurisdictions, and bringing those principles with us over there. We're now active in Yesler Terrace, Central District, Bellevue, and Renton, and looking to further expand our footprint around the Puget Sound area beyond just South Lake Union. So we're not just all South Lake Union anymore. So, but I'm looking forward to sharing a little bit of our lessons learned on this panel. So thanks for having me. Thanks, Brendan. And last but not least, Dan.
Hey, happy to be here. My name is Dan Tedrow. I'm a principal with Säzän Environmental Services. We are headquartered in downtown Seattle with offices in Portland, Tempe, Arizona, and Bremerton. So just on the other side of the sound, of course. I'm happy to be here. We work with high-performing building owners to help them optimize their facilities. So looking at from, we'll call it lust to dust, how do they own, operate, manage their facilities? And I started my career as a facility owner. And one of my passions is, well, how do you take your portfolio of existing facilities and help them operate more efficiently, especially in today's kind of resource constrained environment. So I'm excited to be here and have the conversation.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks everyone for agreeing to come on here today. So we are going to get going here. So Anita, first question to you. What is Unico's approach to building electrification for the new and existing buildings that you have?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the sustainability, it's obviously a big part of our business. We've got a group dedicated to it here, and we understand that electrification is a critical component to reducing our carbon emissions. I'd say that our approach is very, it's project specific, and it's about kind of finding those right opportunities and doing the research to support electrification. For new buildings, it's oftentimes setting those goals early on. We want to set that up front that we want this to be an all electric building, and being able to bake that into our OPR and carry that through design is easier when you say it in the beginning versus late into the design process. And I think having that too, setting it as a goal allows our partners in the design team to kind of help us tell that story. So we can't just focus on talking about EUI, but if we start talking about the overall carbon picture, it paints a different story, and I think it brings people along as you make those decisions. On the existing building side, again, it's working with our engineering team, which is great, our property teams, on making that business case and really planning ahead. We've got, I know we're focused in Seattle here, but just for reference, we've got a number of projects in Colorado that are on district steam, which is quite expensive. And as we think about transitioning those buildings off of steam, that might be in the capital plan for 5 years from now, but we're completing boiler studies today to kind of help make that business case in the future for going with an electric option versus a natural gas boiler. And I think that the other thing I'll just mention, at Unico, we definitely understand this is just part of this solution or equation, right? We've got everything that's, the electricity we use is only as clean as the grid. And here in Seattle, that looks one way. In some of our other markets, it looks very different. So we've also got Unico Solar investors who are focused on developing and owning and operating solar energy systems for both our portfolio and third-party clients. And I'm happy to talk through more examples, but I'd love to hear from other folks as well on this.
Yeah, that's a great segue, because the same question is going to Brandon next.
Similar to Unico, we with our new construction building, which is pretty much all we do. So I have the easiest job of all of our panelists because we mostly just do new construction, and I can appreciate the significant challenge of existing buildings and trying to recast them and invest a lot of money into completely changing your infrastructure there. But new construction is easier if you can instill those principles early on, have project goals related to energy performance and what type of systems you want, and all that gets baked into the owner's project requirements. As Nina was saying early on, it becomes much less costly, and all the team members get buy-in to the, what the finish line is going to look like. And so it is, it's really crucial to get those goals set up front. Now it's not just going to be focused about EUI, as Anita said. It's going to be focused about, what the carbon footprint is, and what the, we're getting into more data now being available to study things like embodied carbon. In what materials do we pick? Do we pick this concrete mix or that concrete mix, and why? Looking at a more holistic impact on the environment than just energy, although energy is really important and probably has the biggest dividends throughout the life of the building. We're now looking at those first cost type of impacts as well. I would say that we, with being involved in the 2030 district, we're always willing to share what we've learned and share that experience, because we want to lift the whole market up in terms of awareness. And we're excited to see that we're not alone, as we probably were in 2002 or 2003 with being interested in this stuff, it's great that everyone has really gotten, especially in the last few years, there's been a sea change in market awareness, probably because it's been elevated so high on the national stage as a priority for everyone in the built environment, that we've now got the legs to really start moving the market and having some real life case studies or experiences that we can share with others makes it less of an obstacle, less of an unknown for developers, for example, who may not have the resources or are reluctant to try something new. It's really important to try and not be afraid to fail. And that's one of the things that our corporate leadership has really stood behind our real estate group, is that they are, including our founder, Mr. Allen, who's passed away, but also our current leadership is very keen on getting us to try things and not being afraid to fail, and having that corporate backing to try to push the envelope and not just be worried about the bottom line. Of course, we are worried about that, but there's corporate support for proceeding with the effort and trying to challenge ourselves constantly. They're 100% supportive of that. So very thankful to work for an organization that allows us to do this.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. I think a couple of things that you brought up there, the case study thing is certainly something that we're interested in, are currently trying to develop more of, just to, like you said, get people more comfortable with it. And then you mentioned embodied carbon. I'll just give a kind of a shout out to the EC3 tool. That if you're interested in kind of learning more about embodied carbon, they have some great resources available. So next, I'll give this to Alex and Dan. Alex, why don't we start with you? So the port, like you mentioned, has a lot of existing buildings, and then that ambitious goal of getting rid of natural gas or fossil gas by the year 2030. Where do you start in implementing building electrification for a project like that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we're still working on that. It's really complicated because, as you mentioned, we have everything from complicated multi-use conference centers to unheated transit sheds and things like that. So where we're really trying to start is by wrapping our arms around what we have and where we have it and what it's used. And so we have 10 major campuses in Port of Seattle's portfolio. 7 of those use fossil natural gas in some capacity. So one of the biggest challenges I think we have is getting a complete picture of all the systems that we have, their ages, where they're located, and what the opportunities are to replace them. So we're in the process of gathering that sort of HVAC inventory, if you will. And then the hope, once we have that, we can look at what the opportunities are to replace those systems. So if you ask me today how we're doing it, it's opportunistic and somewhat reactive, in that things break and we're like, oh, geez, we got to replace this. What can we put in here? But if you ask me our approach in 1 year, maybe 2 years, it's strategic and focused on asset management. So what we're trying to do now is use that sort of inventory to, sort of as Anita referenced, be able to more strategically plan how and when and where we replace those systems, because with more planning, we can do other things like improve the building envelope or replace LED lights, which then may mean that we can put in a smaller HVAC system down the road. So long story short, it's complicated and there's many different types of systems, but we're really doing our best to address them as they come up. And one of the challenges, and I'll just say this one more thing, is that we're going to find as we shoot toward our 2030 target that we're going to have to replace some HVAC systems before the end of their useful life, likely, or use renewable natural gas. And so that's a challenging situation that we have to contend with, and how we can balance that cost differential in retiring equipment early.
That's great. Alex, I'd tag onto that. When you have, let's say, the Port of Seattle or different property owners, you have a large portfolio of buildings, and there's never enough money, time, or people to do everything you want to do. And so, one of the challenges is, well, what do you own and how do you prioritize it? And so when you look at the whole building electrification, you have to understand, well, what's the trigger, right? How do you manage that? And so what I would advocate for is that you want to understand what you own, and you want to look at it. Well, what's the business case? What's the cost benefit? And so if you have a portfolio of buildings, first thing I would always advocate for is look at the energy usage, right? Just kind of making up numbers here, but 20% of your facilities probably use 80% of your energy, right? Just making up numbers, but you really want to focus on the worst case offenders to try to prioritize what facilities do you look at. And then, based on that discussion, then you can kind of do a deeper dive and really look at, well, are these systems coming to end of life, right? And so that's a great way to look at it. And when you're coming to a system with end of life, you want to look at, well, what's the cost of, we'll say, replacing with a modern equivalent? And then what's the cost of building electrification, and what's the cost delta? And generally it's not as high as you might think, because there's a lot of kind of new ways you can kind of reposition and repurpose existing systems to be able to meet those goals cost effectively. And there's a lot of kind of ancillary business benefits that you want to look at regarding as it relates to your organization. So it's cost, benefit, and then also energy kind of lumped in with benefit.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. That's a great point. I think as regulations potentially get more stringent as well, and this potentially goes to existing buildings, then if you're going to that modern equivalent, you potentially have a stranded asset in gas eventually as well. So that's something to consider as well. Yeah,
I'll add one thing about just capacity. I think is another factor that kind of can muddy things sometimes, right? So we might want to make that change from, replacing a boiler to an electric heat pump, but then we don't have the capacity to support it. And so I think, again, like how we think systematically about these things and look for those synergies in the whole building can help to solve that sometimes. But you have to, as much planning ahead as possible to be able to make that case is always helpful.
Yeah. Anita, kind of next question for you as well. Can you talk a little bit about some of the success stories that you have for your all electric buildings?
Yeah, I wanted to just kind of highlight one of our projects right now that's under construction, which is Cascade. It's a new 9-story development in the heart of the Cascade neighborhood, or South Lake Union. I think everyone in Seattle, next time you're headed south on I-5, kind of take a look to the right before the REI flagship, and you'll see it coming up. This is an all-electric building, predicted EUI of around just over 18 kBTUs per square foot. So it's meeting the 2030 challenge for new construction. And along with this really efficient design, we've also got close to 100 kilowatt PV array on the roof. And, to me, before I joined Unico, I was with the US Green Building Council. I have done a lot of work with the LEED program. And to me, one of the big successes with this project was we really focused on energy efficiency. This building is going through Seattle's Green Building Standard. So there was an incentive program available for meeting a LEED Gold standard and being 15% more efficient than energy code. And with the design really focusing on energy efficiency, water performance, a great tenant experience, so just having, there's going to be a great roof deck, a lot of lush plantings, of course, low VOC finishes. That project was able to just demonstrate that it's a LEED Platinum project without really any additional effort and cost. It just really fell into place. And I think, folks with detailed knowledge of LEED know it's kind of a big jump from gold to platinum. And so to have that kind of just naturally happen was really exciting, and I think a big success. Similarly, the building is going to be Salmon Safe certified, and I think it's if we didn't have to chase the certifications, rather like setting those goals and having a strong focus on sustainability allowed those certifications to just fall into place, which helps to celebrate what the building's doing. So
yeah, I think that is, we should start counting the amount of times that Salmon Safe gets mentioned today. I think that's number 2. But if you, just as a side note, that if you are looking to achieve Salmon Safe in new construction, then you also are achieving the 2030 district goal for potable water and stormwater as well, as just an aside.
oh, good to know.
So Brandon, next question for you. What are the main reasons that Vulcan started kind of looking at mostly electric buildings before it was actually a requirement from Seattle Code?
I'd say we started in the residential side. Of course, I'm a residential guy, so I'm gonna be biased here, but yes, we did that for a number of reasons. One was just to lower the carbon footprint, of course. 2, City Light, frankly, gave much better incentives than PSE did at the time. And 3, you know, you know, we didn't see we got a slight edge out of it from an EUI standpoint. I don't know exactly why, or couldn't. I mean, that's a whole nother topic probably to get into. But there was a slight edge in EUI when we looked at those comparing those different systems. And we used to use a mixed fuel back in the 2004 to 2010 era. You know, often the central system for common areas would be off of a gas system, but then you'd have electric systems in the units. But now we're pretty much all electric and have been so for a while. So the code change is already sort of normal for us on the residential side. On the office side, we tend to work with, as you all probably know, single tenant users. So we kind of build the suits. When we have an office building, we'll design it to design development stage and then sort of wait for a tenant. We might market it around for a single tenant user. And then we work with that tenant, if we land a lease, to sort of complete the design, because they're going to have their own ideas about what systems they prefer. And what the great thing about it is now that most of these single user tenants that we build are mostly tech companies like Amazon, Google, Facebook, etc. Most of them have been on board challenging us now on, you know, what else on sustainability or lowering the carbon footprint or what have you. So corporately, those tenants have taken on their own priorities, which is great to see. It's a little more difficult when you're in a multi-tenant situation, because really the building owner is going to be in control of the spec and you're just recruiting tenants to fill the building. But when you can partner with a tenant who you know, shares your priorities or has just as, you know, aggressive goals as you might, it gets a little easier, and you have one person or one entity to work with to complete that design, so you can get everything baked in before it's built. So I'd say we're pretty blessed there.
Thanks, Brandon. Dan, you kind of touched upon this a little bit earlier, but kind of, as you mentioned, kind of organizations are increasingly resource limited, kind of particularly where we are in the world right now. What strategies would you use to kind of balance that cost and value when implementing building electrification?
That's a great question, Matthew. And, you know, I kind of talked about how do you look at the overall building portfolio, and kind of focusing here on existing facilities, right? Once you kind of narrow down what are the called worst offenders, you know, what's coming to end of life, or what gives you the best benefit from a tenant, you know, kind of building occupant standpoint, you know, you really want to dive into the building. And so what you really don't want to do is don't just replace in kind. Don't expect to rip out a boiler, put it in some kind of electric resistance boiler, which, well, you can't really do anymore anyway, but you really want to dig into the facility. And with existing facilities, you look at, well, if the cost to renovate, it's going to be high, right? You've got people impacts, you got building impacts, you have all these constraints and restrictions. And so you want to look at kind of the big three: scope, schedule, and budget, and really understand them. As Anita mentioned earlier, you really want to dig into the upfront planning and site investigation. That's not looking at just the as-builts. That's not doing kind of a desktop review. That's digging into the building. And so, getting in there, walking through the air handlers, measuring your airflows, really understanding what is the impact of this facility and what are the options, right? There's more than one way to skin a cat, so to speak. And each one of those options is going to have an associated cost, right? You want to weigh that cost against, well, what's the benefit? How does that meet your mission? How does that meet your longevity, life cycle cost targets? Because there's so many ways you can do this, and there's so many new technologies. You really want to take this kind of holistic approach to understand, is the first cost might be the cheapest option, but is it going to last 50 years? Maybe, maybe not. How do we want to understand that? And when you're looking at pricing, that's a whole different discussion. But keep in mind that contractors' pricing is related to risk. And so the more you can understand upfront, the more risks you can quantify and eliminate, the better pricing you're going to get. And so all that comes down to is get in the building, dig into it, get your hands dirty, so to speak, and really understand what you're working with.
Thanks, Dan. Alex, kind of similar question to you and how you're applying that to the port, where you obviously do have that finite budget at the Port of Seattle.
Yeah, that's great question. So a few years back, maybe 1 year ago, the Port Commission passed a policy we're calling the Sustainable Evaluation Framework. And the idea behind that policy was that these big capital projects need to include more transparency throughout the entire design and construction process. And this is similar to the Green Building Scorecard that King County uses. But basically, we recognize that when you're adding environmental things to a building and not just replacing like with like, there's usually an incremental cost associated with that. And we found that the port is interested in advancing those sustainability objectives throughout their building portfolio, and to understanding, as Dan said, the costs and benefits associated with those incremental costs. So what we've been really trying to do recently is be able to articulate both the monetary costs associated with adding a heat pump instead of a natural gas boiler, but also the non-monetary costs. So how does this impact equity? How does it impact comfort in the building? How does it support our objectives, or how does it not support our objectives if we decide not to do it? So the way that we've been articulating these investment decisions in our buildings is by basically showing a table that weighs all those monetary and non-monetary benefits. And I think one of the most salient points is Matthew, as you mentioned, 8 years, 9 months. It's not a lot of time. And as these projects come up, we really have one opportunity to take advantage of the HVAC replacement to make a significant difference. And choosing to not replace it with the most energy efficient option basically commits us to something that is mediocre for the next 20, 25 years, right? So I think it's both a benefit for our leadership to be able to see how the projects are developed and implemented, but also a benefit for us, a guy like me who's really trying to push the sustainability angle in our port development portfolio, because it allows me to make a case for why we should spend a little bit more money to advance environmental goals.
Thanks, Alex. Anita, last question to you before we go to the audience questions. What have been some of the challenges that you've experienced in building electrification?
Yeah, I think timing is definitely one of them, especially on the existing building side. And, we've talked a little bit about that. On the new construction side, one thing I'll mention is I think some of the way that we often make the business case for this is pulling in different incentives and programs. And sometimes I think the incentives have to take an approach of being fuel agnostic, and that can create some challenges in showing our actual benefit from a performance standpoint, because we might have an all electric building and from a carbon standpoint, it's great. But when we're comparing it to a gas baseline and just looking at EUI and energy performance, it's not showing the same benefits that it's not showing what we want it to from an incentive standpoint to make that sort of longer big business case. And so I think that, you know, it's bringing those groups and kind of and coming up with custom solutions sometimes, or having those conversations, which take time, but being able to compare things apples to apples is really important. And thinking, I know these incentive programs are designed to reduce carbon emissions, and so reminding folks about that and sort of the bigger picture versus just what the program requirements are about is part of how we do that. But that's not to say it's not a challenge.
Thanks, Anita. Brandon, for you on the new construction side, what has been the additional costs for kind of doing this building electrification, and did it impact financing at all?
No, it has not impacted financing. I don't think we've had a single question that I'm aware of from lenders about why are you doing this or doing that. They seem to trust us that we're doing the right thing. And we've tried some new things, particularly on the residential side. We were, I think, the second installation of a reverse cycle chiller, which is now going to be in the code for domestic hot water heating. It was uncharted territory because no one had done one in Seattle yet when we committed to do it. Happy we did it and became our new standard for multifamily in our portfolio going forward. So now it's no big deal. But when you're taking a leap of faith like that on a new technology, it does cost a little bit more incrementally. That's going to save if you get it in the spec and commit to it up front, then try to do it later on in the design process, of course. But we also want to make sure that our residents have functioning hot water. So sometimes you'll invest maybe a little bit more in a backup system in case you have to take it down for maintenance or you have to fix it somehow. That might be another additional first cost that you might invest. If you're an early adopter and want to be sure the thing works right. We did the same thing with a sewer waste heat recovery project that we had in South Lake Union. We're like, well, what if it doesn't work? We can't really have residents with no hot water. That would be bad. So we make an investment in a backup system to take over or to supplement if it needs to. And as the technology gets refined and as we all learn better lessons from it, then you can start backing off some of that extra cost. And it becomes a more routine spec that the maintenance community is familiar with maintaining, and our mechanical and electrical designers are more familiar with to spec. We have more products on the market to choose from, that kind of thing. So I'd say those have been our biggest challenges. On the office side, I'd say, like I said, it's really, since we've mostly worked with single tenants, it's more about getting cooperation from the tenant. We've looked at office buildings, have been ranging more recently. The ones that we're designing and building now would be in the range of 35 if it was a mixed fuel, but it'd be more like 32 if it was all electric, depending on what options they pick for electrical equipment. And on the residential side, our last generation that we've built with RCCs in them have ranged from 16 to 22. That's actual operating properties today. The ones we're designing right now are around a 15. So in residential, we've only got HVAC and domestic hot water heating is 25% of our building load now. So we squeezed that down that far, and plug loads is actually our biggest user at this point. We haven't paid much attention to managing plug loads yet, but that will be an interesting challenge.
Yeah, plug loads came up on another call yesterday, and I think it's definitely the next challenge, and potentially also one of the lessons that we might be able to gain from this time where buildings have been unoccupied. There's still a lot of energy use happening for just kind of general building systems, but there are less plug loads, so we might get a better sense of what usage that takes up in buildings. So we have about 15 minutes left, and we have quite a few questions coming in here, so I want to try and get through as many as possible here. Anita, the first one's from you from Dwayne Johnlin with the City of Seattle. Is there a business case for the conversion from gas boilers to heat pumps?
I think it's project by project. Sometimes I think it can be challenging. You have to factor in incentives and sort of this bigger picture. And I think what Alex was talking about, sort of looking holistically at all of the other benefits, and bringing our market leaders into this conversation when they're having leasing conversations. I think all of those are a component to making that business case and making this successful. I'm happy to kind of look for some examples and share afterwards if that would be useful.
Dan, Alex, I was
just going to add, I think there's a business case or a cost of inaction or a cost of the wrong action. And, our theory is that if we, take this kind of asset management approach that I described, where we have all of our ducks in a row and we're thinking about things, 5-10 years in the future and setting ourselves up for success, then savings will come from taking early and coordinated action. It also positions us well to capture incentives. I saw someone talking about in the chat, talking about the new Washington state legislation coming down that requires something similar to the building tune-up. But if you are able to take advantage of that before it becomes law, then incentives are available. And so there is an encouraging side to taking early action. And so I think all those things combined can make what's generally an expensive and maybe not life cycle cost effective investment a little bit more palatable over the long term.
I would add to that, going from boilers to heat pumps, it doesn't necessarily have to be as big of a lift. A lot of times people think heat pumps are kind of just, air source and just basically heating or cooling air. There's a pretty good array of new products, heat pump chillers out there that work well for retrofit applications, and they can provide simultaneous heating and cooling. And so there's a lot of neat things you can do with that. And there's a lot of great avenues for energy recovery. So for instance, we just finished a project with Alex, and we were looking at reconverting basically heat recovery from some big refrigeration systems to help offset heating and cooling loads using these heat pump type chillers. And so it gets exciting because there's a lot of kind of creative ways you can do it, which kind of lessen that upfront financial impact. That being said, when you're looking at the benefit, there's this 330-300 rule. $3 is essentially your cost for utilities, 30 is rent, 300 is people. And so when you're looking at Seattle as a whole, it's becoming more and more of a tech-based city. And so there is a benefit to having these kind of greener systems, and that's recruitment and retention for your clients. And so, as you're looking at these different upgrades, don't forget to rule that out.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Alex, I'm going to ask you the next question just because I know that you're working on a project like this. Have incentives around building renovation or repositioning versus new construction been discussed? Incentives for carbon footprint reduction, and perhaps an incentive for a complete whole building life cycle study?
Yeah, well, they haven't been discussed yet in this meeting, but we are always tracking incentives and trying to work as closely as we can with, in most cases, Seattle City Light or Puget Sound Energy. We've been very successful in leveraging incentives to transition to LED lighting. But what's more interesting, and honestly, we haven't been able to take advantage of it yet, is larger, more holistic programs for that, exactly what you described, Matthew, transitioning whole buildings or taking that whole building approach. And I think one of the challenges that we have is, and I understand it, the incentive programs are prescriptive and sometimes complicated. And if you don't have the exact right project or the timing doesn't line up perfectly, it's sometimes challenging to take advantage of it. So we continue to track those opportunities and to think about how we can best, take advantage of those incentives. Same with grant funding, of course. But it's an absolutely essential component for, making this transition possible, especially for governments.
Yeah. Anita, would you add anything to that?
No, I mean, I think I just completely agree that there is looking for the opportunities and pairing the incentives, even if they're, the meets or the energy efficiency as a service program. It's not specifically about electrification, but if we can sort of use programs like that to focus on decarbonization, I think that's a really powerful thing. So it's, I think it's definitely part of the equation in making it work.
Yeah, I would be remiss to not take the opportunity here to plug the 2030 Challenge pilot program, which does exactly this. So if you're looking at doing a major building renovation, it gives you a large density bonus for that existing building for meeting the 2030 Challenge goals, similar to the Living Building pilot program, but for existing buildings.
I heard on a call earlier this week that there have not yet been any participants with that pilot, so it's wide open. We all need to jump in there.
Yeah. The next question here is, where do you see hydrogen fuel cells in the picture? And that's hydrogen produced from clean, renewable electricity.
I'll start, but it's not the answer you want. It's really, we're not at the port, we're not considering the use of renewable hydrogen in buildings. However, in maritime applications, such as ships and cargo handling equipment, potentially trucks, there is a very real application for hydrogen. And that's sort of an exciting new fuel source that is, I think, coming to fruition in Washington in the next several years. So stay tuned. That could be a really good opportunity for some of these hard to transition fossil fuel intensive pieces of equipment to get off fossil fuels and use something other like hydrogen, renewable hydrogen.
All right, I'm going to jump around here a little bit because I think this is an interesting question. Have you seen any insurance benefits in all electric assets for not having natural gas on site?
No.
I was afraid that was going to be the answer. Anita,
I can't speak. I can't speak to that directly, but I'm going to guess a similar answer.
All right. We didn't necessarily touch on this, but I know, Brandon, you have touched on this in conversations that we've had. How is cooking being handled, either for residential tenants or for food services spaces and retailers?
So residential tenants, gas cooking has been sort of a market differentiator that you usually see at the luxury end of the market, either in condominiums or very high-end apartments. And that is because, people like to, mostly for people who like to cook or foodies or something. So their gas gives you a lot more control over the cooking. There's not the residual heat that there is with an electric cooktop. But most of the apartment industry does not invest in that gas because it is expensive. You've got a whole piping system you have to take up in the building. It's actually a little bit easier to do in a high rise than a more laterally distributed mid-rise or larger, building footprint type building. It's more expensive actually pound for pound to do it in a mid-rise than it is in a high rise. So you typically usually see it in high rises. But it's something that I think, even though it is a market differentiator, you might get some localities that give you a premium for having it in the building. Most of us use electric smooth top cooktops now. Induction would be great, but the price point is significantly higher, like 50% to 100%, depending on the brand, higher than the electric smooth top equivalent. And you have to have the right cookware to use it. So it has to be basically magnetic. And so what I'm hoping to see is that the gas differentiator is replaced by that electric induction. The code, as you probably know, is going to say, well, if you're going to do gas, you got to have your electric hookup right next to it. So you're going to have this duplicative cost now, which is another disincentive to get away from the gas cooking in the units. In the retail context, we don't have great alternatives from what I understand for commercial cooking equipment. There's induction pieces available, not for everything, but for some pieces. But that is, in the commercial equipment world, about two times the cost of the gas-fired version. So there is some work that needs to be done there to broaden the product line and lower the price point, especially for mom and pop businesses that can't really afford an induction cooking line. A lot of it's also going to depend on what you're cooking. Are you a steakhouse or are you a teriyaki place? So, it depends on what kind of restaurant it is, whether they even can do it without gas. So that remains to be seen. And for now, that is one of the exceptions that we make in our buildings, is that if we have a sort of preordained restaurant space, we're going to have a gas connection available, and depends whether that space actually gets leased by a restaurant or not, at least the connection is there if it is a restaurant. And it's got all the ventilation pathways that you'd need for a restaurant to be in that space, already baked into the shell and core. On the residential side, really the only thing we got left is cooking grills on the rooftop usually, which are gas, because when we plumb them with natural gas, because propane is not only worse for the environment, but it requires transportation costs to shuttle it to and from the property, and the residents don't really want to have to change the tanks out. So we found that we have an all-electric building in South Lake Union, that the only gas use in the building right now is those grills, and it's about 700 therms a year to run 2 grills, which is equivalent of like 4/5 of a car per year in terms of carbon emissions. So we're down to a fairly negligible amount to manage, but the alternative is actually worse. It's 25% more carbon if you did the propane route, which is what you would do if you were prohibited from using natural gas. The aftermarket solution would be a propane grill, and that's actually a worse outcome.
Yeah, unless the weather gets a lot better in the summers and then people start grilling a lot more, and then gas usage is going to go way up. Big proponent of grilling in the summer. I want to touch on this question. I think it might be the last one. Are you seeing opportunities like CPACER financing help to meet compliance with the new state clean building standard and new Seattle code? And if you don't know about CPACER, then we have our next, well, you have a webinar to watch from last month. Here.
I think we're still getting our feet wet with it, is what I'll say. So I don't have a strong answer at this point, but it's something we're definitely exploring.
Yeah, so for those of you on the call, CPACER is coming to King County. They're in the process of creating the program now, and they're kind of doing outreach to folks. There's a couple of webinars online. We did one, I think, in December with King County that you can watch on our YouTube channel. It just gives a great overview of what the program is, and hopefully will be signed in by King County Council this summer. So unfortunately, we are out of time. I will try and kind of copy a lot of these questions, and I'll see if I can get answers back to folks after the meeting by conferring with the panelists. But we'd just like to thank everyone again for taking the time, the panelists. The big thing that really I heard was planning is what is needed to electrify buildings, whether it's new construction projects starting early and setting the goal, or with existing buildings planning kind of 5 to 10 years down the line to position your buildings for a lot of this building electrification. So thank you everyone for spending your morning with us. This again has been recorded, so we'll put it up on the YouTube channel, and have a great rest of your day.